Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We were saying before you all popped in, what else could we all want to do with our time besides spend 90 minutes talking about lobbying rules? So we're so happy you're here. It is an important, if tedious, topic, and we're going to dive right in. I'd like to take a minute before we get started to introduce our panelist, who's an attorney. Norah Jones is one of the founders and principals of C3 Legal. Norah's practice focuses primarily on representing public charities and private foundations. She also advises family offices and founders in the creation and operation of new philanthropic vehicles. And she has a particular passion for organizations focused on economic justice and community safety. So we'll share her LinkedIn profile and her law firm's website in chat shortly. And I wanted to also take a minute to introduce myself. For those that I don't know, I'm Holly Ambuehl. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs at Forefront. I've been at Forefront about 4 years, and I've done a lot of these trainings in that time because there's such a need for this in our sector. So it's always a pleasure. And every time I do this training, I also learn new things based on the questions folks ask and what's happening in the field. So we just want to ask you to fully participate today with questions and share examples so that we can all continue to learn together how to hopefully improve the rules as well. When we hear about your challenges, that helps us know how to make recommendations about how to improve the rules and regulations to the Secretary of State. With us today is are my colleagues on the policy team, Sebastian Wong and Lacey Winfield. They're both new-ish and were not at this training last year, but we're so thrilled to have them on board, and they'll both be chiming in today, so you'll get a chance to get to know them a little bit better. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Lacey, our policy coordinator, and she's going to just do a brief reminder about Forefront and what we do, and then hand it back to me we'll go right to Norah for a review of the federal lobbying rules and dive into the learning content for today. So Lacey, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Lacey Winfield. I'm the policy coordinator here at Forefront. And I'm just going to kind of give you all a rundown, of who Forefront is. So we are a membership organization where we serve both philanthropic organizations and operating nonprofits. Our fundamental commitments to you all is to educate, convene, and mobilize the sector on a statewide level. And we make sure that any of the policies and advocacy work that we're doing is through a racial equity lens. Our memberships include stakeholders for individuals. We have operating nonprofits, obviously, from a wide variety of, from health to arts to museums, environmentalist groups. And for our grant makers, they include all types of grant makers from private, family, community foundations, and donor advised funds. Some of our member benefits include a job board, so you can post your job and then you can all post jobs, and you can also find jobs on our website. Some of our two biggest member benefits is our peer Skillshare. So it's basically if you have a question or need help with something, you could connect with us at Forefront, who will then connect you with somebody and able to get your question answered, excuse me. And then our main thing our biggest benefit is those library services. So we have 2 in-house librarians who can guide you through research and help you find grants for some type of projects you're working on. Our membership fee is based on a sliding scale of revenue. So we have membership fees as low as $65 a year, mostly for organizations that are outside of Chicago. More services that we have for all of our stakeholders. So that includes, one of our big things is our bi-weekly newsletter. We send a newsletter out bi-weekly to let you know what we're doing as a team, as a total Forefront team, and any activities or events that we'll be having as well. We have some of our big things like the Equitable Access and Capacity Initiative. This is essentially a way to help organize, operate nonprofits to prepare and manage government funding. And then we have our newest service, which is the Mission Sustainability Initiative. This is a resource for collaboration, partnership, mergers, coalitions, where there is confidential conversations on how to build resilience for operating nonprofits in the sector. there's a lot of things that are happening and there's essentially an attack on the sector right now. So we created this service to help you all kind of navigate through that. We also have our racial equity collective. We just finished up the 2025 cohort. Not sure we'll be having our 2026 cohort, but these are organizations that have come together who have a racial equity lens and trying to create racial equity in the state of Illinois. And then obviously we have our public policy and advocacy where you can learn more about us through signing up for our Action Center. Our Action Center allows for you to have um, quickly release news from a policy level, and also if we need to connect with legislators on an issue, that you all can reach out to them directly. So who does Forefront work with on a federal and a state level? We do federal and state level work. On a federal level, we work closely with our national organizations like National Council Nonprofit, United Philanthropy Forum, the Council on Foundation a little bit, independent sector. So we really look to them when there are breaking news from a federal level to see what's going on and how to support you all. And then we also work with trade organizations in Illinois. Here are a plethora of the ones we work with that we look for guidance on how to help individual organizations in different parts of the sector. And then a bit more on who the policy team is. So as Holly said, we're a team of three now. We're governed by our board of directors that allow us to help us with our position statements. But we also have a policy committee that helps us with our annual agenda. And our annual agenda is essentially what we follow for the year of what we notice, the trends that need to be helped on from a policy level. Um, we get this information not only from our policy committee, but from you all as members. We have surveys and member focus groups, so we really know what's going on, have feedback in order to make sure that we're working on things that will impact you all immediately. We do a little bit of local work, not much, but mostly state and federal work or policy speaking. And we do have educational events as of this one, where we have our policy Thursdays, or we have events throughout the year that in order to help educate every folks and know what's going on. We have a plethora of position statements, but this is the main one we'll be focusing on today. Is essentially we defend democratic participation, civic engagement. That's why we're here today, in order for you all to be able to participate and advocate on the lobby and advocacy. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I was doing so good, then forgot everything. Sorry. Advocacy and lobbying, and so we have this position statement in order for y'all to do that. Some of the events that we have for Forefront is we have our weekly member briefing Friday at 9 a.m. It's where we give you all updates on the federal and state level, what's going on. We will have our December 4th new laws briefing, and that is just any new laws that have been created and enacted in Illinois that may impact the sector or may regulate the entire sector. And then on January 15th is when we have our 2026 legislative kickoff. So please scan the QR code to see what events we'll be having throughout the year. And then contact us. We love hearing from you all to know what's really going on, what's maybe impacting you, and how can we potentially change things on a policy level. And with that, I will slide it to Norah.
Hey, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me with you today. I'm actually looking forward to talking about lobbying rules for public charities. I think it's a really important topic, especially, well, at any time, but I think especially in today's environment. There's a number of slides in the deck that will be, I think, primarily for future reference. I'm going to fly through them today. It's a really dense topic, and we won't be able to get into all of the nuances and the weeds. But what I hope that you come away from today's presentation thinking is that if you are a 501c3 public charity, and if there's a mission related benefit to getting involved in lobbying, the tax code and the treasury regulations create a path for you to do that. There is I would say one of the larger misconceptions in the 501c3 world is there's often a belief that 501c3 organizations are not allowed to lobby. And I think if we can clear up that misconception in today's discussion, then that's a win for everybody. It's a win for the sector and it's a win for the community. Now that it's not a blanket statement that applies to the entire 501c3 sector, as we'll talk about. But if you are a 501c3 public charity, then these rules are for you. And you should kind of go back to your organizations and go back to your boards and think about whether there is a place for lobbying in what you do. And if so, there's a really good roadmap out there on how you do it in a way that's compliant and does not risk your 501c3 or public charity status. Okay, so next slide. What I want to cover in a pretty short order, just some key definitions, some exceptions to lobbying, how you calculate lobbying, and some other related considerations. Next slide. Big picture before we start, and this is just as a matter of level setting, the entire 501c3 universe is divided into two big categories. By default, 501c3 organizations are private foundations. So that is the default category for a 501c3 organization. If you are a 501c3 organization that can demonstrate to the IRS on an initial and ongoing basis that you actually meet a public charity test, then you can get out of private foundation status and be a 501c3 that is a public charity. Public charities and private foundations, they are both 501c3 organizations. Private foundation is the default subcategory, but many 501c3 organizations, and I'm assuming most of you on the call today, work with 501c3s that are public charities. They've gotten out of that private foundation status. Next slide. The reason that this is important for today's conversation in particular is that the language of 501c3 says that all 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code says that 501c3 organizations can participate in some degree of lobbying. However, Treasury regulations then later take that away for private foundations. Pardon me, I'm tripping over my words. So 501c3 organizations that are public charities are allowed to engage in some level of lobbying. 501c3 organizations that are private foundations are not allowed to engage in or support lobbying, period. Both categories, public charities and private foundations, so the entire 501c3 universe, are not allowed to engage in any degree whatsoever in any kind of political campaign activity. So no activity in support of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. That is universal. That is all 501c3 organizations. But outside of the political campaign activity world, when we're thinking about lobbying, public charities can do it. Private foundations cannot. And that's in part why Forefront does a separate lobbying training for private foundations in the spring. Today, we're really focusing on the public charity rule. Next slide, please. When you are a public charity, there are two potential tests that apply that govern how much lobbying you are allowed to do and some other related considerations. The default test is called the no substantial part test. And what that test says is that, actually, we can skip to the next slide. That test just says that no substantial part of your overall activities can be lobbying. In reverse, lobbying can only be an insubstantial part of your overall activities. Beyond that, we don't really know what that means. We don't know what substantial means. We don't really know what insubstantial means. It's a very fuzzy, very subjective test. We do know that it includes both expenditures you make, so the actual dollar value of salaries or consultant payments or equipment costs that are used for lobbying, and it includes the value of efforts that you shepherd for a lobbying activity. So if you are a public charity subject to the no substantial part test, and you fill a bunch of school buses with volunteers and drive them all down to Springfield for a lobby day, you need to put a value on all of that volunteer time, in addition to the cash expenditures that you've made for, renting the buses and, presumably buying people lunch and that sort of thing. So it's a murky, broad, subjective test. Next slide. The alternative is what's called the 501H election. And the 501H election gets you out of that subjective murky category to a large degree, and it gets you into a very objective test where we have more clear definitions on exactly what lobbying is and what it isn't. We also have dollar limits. So in the 501H test, you are not counting volunteer time or the value of efforts. You only count actual expenditures, actual money that you have spent on lobbying efforts. And there are clear limits that you are provided for how much lobbying you can conduct in a year. And there is a procedure and a framework set up that in advance that tells you essentially, if I go over this, at what point, number one, I'm going to be subject to penalty tax, but at what point might I actually jeopardize my 501c3 status? Next slide. Real quickly, you can see here how when you are in the 501H test, the amount that you are allowed to spend on lobbying depends on your organization's annual budget. So the larger the organization, the more that they are allowed to spend on lobbying in any given year. It maxes out at $1 million of lobbying expenses in a year for the largest organizations. That's a lot of lobbying. And so even at the smaller end of the spectrum, even if you're looking at, spending $500,000, or, if you're talking about spending, $100,000 a year on lobbying, that's a lot of lobbying. That's a lot that you can accomplish within that budget, especially when, as we'll see later, a lot of advocacy does not count as lobbying. So there is a significant amount of advocacy out there in the world that is not even subject to the test in the first place. This test looks at lobbying and lobbying specifically. So we'll talk some more about that. Next slide. When you are in the 501H test and you're trying to figure out what your lobbying budget is and what expenses and expenditures you're going to have that will count toward it, it is a broad test. So it looks at all of the costs of preparing and engaging in lobbying. So preparing to lobby is the same thing as actual lobbying in this test. It's going to include overhead. It includes compensation, the allocable portion of salary and benefits that you pay to your staff who are engaged in lobbying. It includes, the amounts that you might pay to an actual lobbyist to help you with lobbying, all expenses. And all of those expenses you're going to be counting from the time that you are preparing a lobbying effort to the time that you are actually implementing that lobbying effort. Next slide. Moving out of kind of the framework of what these two tests look at, well, I should say before we do that, I just want to reflect for a minute that as we move forward from here, all of these specific definitions and specific exceptions to definitions, these apply in the 501H expenditure test. So this is an example of what I meant when I said that the default no substantial part test is pretty subjective, kind of murky. We don't really have great guidelines or rules that we can apply. When you're in the 501H expenditure test, things still get pretty murky, believe me, but we've got a much better, clear framework of the definitions that we're working with and what we're talking about. And so everything from this point forward, these are definitions and guidelines that clearly apply in the 501H context. They might apply in the no substantial part test too. We don't know that for sure. So when we're in the 501H test, first thing you want to ask yourself is, are we even talking about lobbying? People talk about advocacy and lobbying like they're interchangeable. For 501c3 purposes, they are not. Lobbying is a very specific type of advocacy. It is not all advocacy. It is a very specific type of advocacy. And to be lobbying, most critically, you need legislation. Lobbying in this 501c3 context includes and requires legislation. It is a communication that refers to and reflects a view on specific legislation. Next slide, please. Legislation here is an act by Congress, the state legislature, the city council, the Cook County Board, something that goes before a legislative body for approval and adoption. It also includes the public on a ballot if the ballot is a binding referendum. So, I'm losing track of time a bit, but, a couple of years ago, the Fair Tax Amendment, that was considered specific legislation for these purposes, because when it went to the general public was acting as if it was the legislative body. I'll say again that in the 501c3 public charity context, to be lobbying, to even be in the lobbying universe, you have to have legislation. So a specific piece of legislation that is either being drafted, introduced, being amended, people are fighting to defeat it in a legislative body. Next slide, please. Legislation does not include administrative actions. It doesn't include litigation. It doesn't include executive actions, executive orders. So once, as an example, the state budget here, that is legislation. So work that organizations do to try to get something in the budget or revise the budget or amend the budget, that is lobbying. Once the state budget has been adopted and the state agencies are now implementing and developing their budgets, that is no longer legislative work. You are now in the regulatory or administrative regime, and that is not considered lobbying for these purposes. Next slide, please. Very quickly, I want to just cover that in the 501h world, there are two types of lobbying that we deal with, and each is subject to its own limit. Next slide. The first, and I would say most typical in my experience, is what's called direct lobbying. And this is what we kind of classically think of when you participate in a lobby day, or typically often, I should say, when you participate in Foundations on the Hill. This is when you, as a representative of an organization, communicate directly with a member of a legislative body or a person on their staff. Next slide, please. And in that communication, you refer to specific legislation and you take a view on it. So that is when you show up at a senator's office and you say, hey, Bill 123 is making its way through Springfield right now. We are in favor of it because blah, blah, blah. Please vote for it. Or we're against it. Please don't vote for it. That is considered direct lobbying. Next slide, please. The indirect lobbying, the communication must refer to and reflect a view on the specific lobbying that you're talking about. Next. The second type of lobbying or subtype of lobbying is called grassroots lobbying. And that is when you are reaching out to the public, you are informing them about specific legislation, you are taking a view on that specific legislation, and you are encouraging them to reach out to their elected officials to vote yes or no on the legislation. So direct is, you walking into or emailing or calling your state senator or state representative's office to encourage them to vote yes or no on a bill. Grassroots lobbying is sending an email out to your members or your supporters or people affiliated with you, telling them, hey, call your elected officials and ask them to vote yes or no on this particular bill. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip over this, but there's a whole bunch of nuance and kind of subjective factors that can go into when a communication is grassroots or not. But what I would say to you as a practical takeaway is think, is this lobbying? Think about lobbying if you're sending out a message to the public, asking them to call their elected official to take action on a particular bill. It might be, it might not be lobbying, but it's always good to safe rather than sorry here. So think about lobbying when you're doing those types of communications. Next slide, please. I would say, oh, sorry, one more slide. And one more. Okay. I would say that almost as important as understanding what the code defines as lobbying is recognizing that there's a huge universe of advocacy out there that is not considered lobbying. Next slide. The code and the regulations identify 4 main categories of advocacy type communications that are specifically not considered lobbying. Nonpartisan analysis, study, or research, examinations and discussions of broad social problems, technical advice, and self-defense communication. Let's jump ahead a slide and talk about nonpartisan analysis, study, or research. I don't have a scientific study on this, but my sense is that most advocacy type communications that are exceptions from lobbying are exceptions because they fall under this particular exception. This is like the classic white paper idea, where you are addressing an issue, you are evaluating an issue, you might advocate a particular viewpoint or position, and say, you know, this budget is bad, or, you know, this housing ordinance is positive for the community. But, and here's what's critical, your paper, your analysis has to present the facts broadly and fairly, and it has to be drafted in a way that would allow a reader to come to a different decision or conclusion than the one that you came to. So this kind of classic white paper report exception, I think, is used quite frequently. Next slide, please. And then we'll skip one more. And one more. One more, sorry. This is an important piece to keep in mind. If you want to take advantage of the white paper exception here, then you have to be careful about collaborating either with folks inside your organization or at other organizations. If your non-lobbying white paper is later used in a lobbying activity, it is possible for the IRS to go back and make that white paper lobbying, even though it wasn't in the first place. So be mindful of, you know, we're all very collaborative in this field, but it doesn't work if you say, okay, we'll do the white paper, and then, hey, peer organization, you're going to take our white paper and use it in your lobby day. That's not going to work. You're going to lose the exception, and your work on that white paper is going to be considered lobbying, even though you were not actually the one that did it. If you, on the other hand, release your white paper and kind of put it out there in the world, and somebody grabs it and they use it without any intention or expectation or coordination on your part, that's completely different. It's not going to, it should not come back and convert your work into lobbying. It's when it is being done with the knowledge or expectation that that's exactly what's going to happen. That's where the facts matter and the you know, the circumstances matter. All right, next slide, please. Oh, that's what I just said. All right, one more. This is an exception to the exception, which is, you know, one of the things we run into a lot. That's subsequent use rule, that recapture or recharacterization rule typically comes into play, but there are times where it isn't going to apply. But again, I think the practical point here is be mindful as you are preparing a report or a material. If there are already conversations about how it's going to be used in a lobbying context, be mindful that you may be getting yourself into a lobbying situation. Just in interest of time, let's jump ahead a few slides to technical advice or assistance. Here we go, perfect. So the technical advice or assistance exception is one that would allow an organization, a public charity, to actually provide its view on specific legislation to a legislative body in limited circumstances. I'll tell you that I did not used to give this exception a lot of time or thought because it didn't appear to me to be one that ever really came up in practice. I have really changed my view on this. And I think that if you are an organization that is involved in or has strong views on legislative proposals, you can probably use the technical advice. You can be prepared to use the technical advice or assistance exception in a really strategic manner. What this says is that if your organization gets a written request from a government body or a committee in the name of the government body or in the name of the legislative committee, asking for your view on some pending legislation or an amendment to pending legislation, you can provide that view and it is not going to be considered lobbying. You have to provide your response to the entire body or the legislative committee, whichever was the one that requested it. But where I think there is some very strategic planning that can be done here is if you have good relationships, your organization has good relationships with its elected officials in Springfield, if they call you and say, hey, I just saw this bill, I'm wondering what you think, should I vote for this? Should I not? Are there amendments? What should I do? You have a choice to make. If you're a public charity, you can respond, you can talk to them, you can say, I think it's good, I think it's bad, and tell them what you think they should do. And that's going to be considered lobbying because you are having a direct communication with a legislator or a member of their staff about specific legislation, taking a view on it. So that's going to be lobbying, and you have to report it as such and track it as such. That might be perfectly fine, depending on how much other lobbying you've done in the year. Or you can pause and say, hey, friend, I'd love for us to be able to give you our advice, but we do not engage in lobbying. If you are on a committee that is evaluating this bill, can you have the committee send us a written request for our advice and reaction to what the bill says? That may not work in every case, but maybe it works enough where you can participate more freely without running into the lobbying treatment and the lobbying tracking. So I flagged this because I think it's more valuable than I used to think. Next slide. On the other, one more, sorry. On the other side of the spectrum are self-defense communication. People talk about these all the time as an exception to lobbying. They rarely work. This exception rarely works because it is drafted in such a limited manner that it does not cover as much as what we would think and what we would like it to cover. What the language of the exception says that an organization appearances before or communications with a legislative body about a possible decision that might impact one of, all right, next slide, please, the organization's existence, its powers and duties, its tax exempt status, or the deductibility of contributions to it. That's it. So the legislation has to specifically fall within one of these four things in order for the self-defense communication exception to exist. The IRS has specifically and repeatedly said that a particular piece of legislation's impact on an organization's budget does not meet the self-defense communication. Yes, it might be true that if the state budget stopped funding, early childhood education, your organization might go out of business. That does not qualify for the self-defense communication. So if you are communicating with a legislator about that bill, it's going to be lobbying. It will not fall within this exception. Things that do fall within the exception are when Congress is, thinking about changing the level of deductibility for charitable contributions. Some debate about does the, do the 501p regulations or proposed rules about terrorist supporting organizations, do those count? Would those fall within self-defense communications? We don't really know. It's very murky. So while self-defense communications maybe feels at first blush like it's really broad, in practice, it's pretty darn limited. Now, I'm going to wrap up in just a minute, but what I want to leave you with is these rules can be very complicated and it can feel really daunting, but in practice, it's a pretty step-by-step analysis. And a couple of things that are really important in my view for public charities to keep in mind is that the rules are set up there to give you a guideline on how you can be involved in lobbying without jeopardizing your 501c3 status. They are not there to disincentivize lobbying. They are there to tell you, here's how you do it and here's how you limit it in a way that maintains your 501c3 status intact. So we think of it as if you're a 501c3 organization and you're a public charity, you have the legal right to lobby. And oftentimes your organization is in a better position than most to really understand the rules and the issues that are at stake with specific legislation. And so it can make a lot of sense to take a look at how you could, in a safe and appropriate manner, incorporate some lobbying activity into what you do. There's a ton of resources out there that help, provide further education. Forefront does a lot of it. Boulder Advocacy is an organization in DC that has really great plain language fact sheets on how to do this. I'm not saying everybody should run out of this meeting and start lobbying this afternoon, but I do think that there's a lot of comfort in having these rules available and knowing what you can do in a way that that's safe and comfortable within your 501c3 public charity status. All right, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nora. Excellent. Those that aren't watching chat, if you take a minute and take a peek, there's a lot in there for you. And I wanted to, Nora, just quickly confirm there was a question. The rules for C4s are different, correct? So just, looking for affirmation. We're not talking about rules that apply to C4s today.
Right. Yeah, they have very different rules. C4s are not charitable organizations. C4s can conduct 100% lobbying. 100% of their activity can be lobbying, and C4s are allowed to engage in some degree of political campaign activity. So while C3s cannot do any political campaign activity, C4s can do some. C4s can do all lobbying, and C3 public charities are limited.
Thanks for that. And then I'm about to cover the state rules, which are different. So I just wanted to underline that everything Nora just said is how the IRS defines and handles lobbying and requires reporting of lobbying activity. The state rules are very different. That's part of why folks get confused and why we do this training. So stay tuned for that. And then Sherry in chat asked a question. And if I understand it correctly, what she's looking for is your comments about if you're, since the IRS defines lobbying as speaking to legislation, like what about a scenario when you're telling a public official, I need you to fix this, but there's no bill yet? Would that still be lobbying?
I do not think I need you to fix this is lobbying. Similarly saying, hey, we need some legislation to deal with this problem, or this problem is so complicated, it needs a legislative solution. That is not lobbying. But once a bill starts getting crafted, once it's being drafted and people are trying to figure out what goes into it, what shouldn't go into it, then it converts to lobbying. There's some mystical, magical time where non-lobbying communications turn into lobbying, and it's really hard to say this is when it is, but a general statement of this situation is a mess, you got to fix this. I would not consider that lobbying.
Thank you, helpful. I have a request from Jason to go back to the mass media slide. So we can take a minute to do that before we switch to state. That was, let's see, Lacey, if you can kind of toggle back till we see where that was. There we go. Norah, can you just speak to that quickly?
Yeah, so the idea here is that if there's going to be a presumption that public communication is grassroots lobbying if you are timing the release of that mass communication with the timing of a vote. And so it's in a way, it's the IRS saying to us, don't get too cute. You know, you can't try and say, oh, it's not grassroots lobbying. This isn't lobbying because, you know, we didn't include a call to action, but you put out a, you know, full page ad in the Trib or Block Club, you know, a week before the budget vote saying, if this budget gets adopted as is, it's going to decimate, you know, homelessness funding in Illinois. They're going to say, yeah, that's lobbying. That the facts and circumstances of the situation make it pretty clear that what you were trying to do is lobby.
Thank you. Helpful. Jason, if you have a follow-up, go ahead and pop that in chat. But it sounds like for now we've covered your question. So I'm going to turn our attention now to lobbying rules at the state level. And Illinois, unfortunately, we're in the position here in Illinois of having state lobbying rules, which vary significantly from federal rules and also are, when compared to other states' rules, fairly strict and sweeping. And so it is very important for folks in our sector to be aware of our state lobbying rules. And so that's why we're going to spend some time on this, and then we can answer any follow-up questions. So here we have the comparison between how the federal government and the state of Illinois define lobbying. As Norah explained, the federal government's definition is fairly narrow, and direct lobbying requires that three-pronged test of communication with the legislator or their staff that expresses a view about specific legislation. Whereas the state of Illinois, sorry, and just to back up for a moment, the federal government also does not include administrative rulemaking in its definition of lobbying. In contrast, the state of Illinois has a more sweeping definition where they include administrative rulemaking, communications with local officials, and attempts to, quote, influence or garner goodwill, which are terms that aren't well defined or well understood. And so it's at the state level an environment that can cause some confusion, and rightly so. And so we're going to walk through this a little bit more, but I want to underscore how important it is to, when you have questions about the state rules, to reach out to the Secretary of State's office and get their advice when there's a gray area or an area of uncertainty. So we'll provide information about how to do that at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the state includes local officials in the list of covered officials in terms of targets for lobbying. So that changed on January 1st, 22. And that was a significant change that kind of uniquely impacts the nonprofit sector because we interact so frequently with our local officials. There's all kinds of programs between nonprofits and their township or their county board or their school districts or you know, other local bodies. And so it's important to understand that when there's frequent contacts between nonprofit employees and local officials, that the state would then require you to register with them as a lobbyist. And that's somewhat unique among states and a big change. Next slide, please. So where the federal government's interest in your lobbying activity as a public charity pertains to how much lobbying you can do in order to protect your tax exempt status. And so they're looking at, like, in comparison to all of your activities and expenses, what percentage or amount is related to lobbying. The state's interest is more about putting sunshine on activities that happen outside of the public eye and also when money is changing hands. And so for the state, in addition to having the sweeping definition of lobbying, there's also an all or nothing scenario where it doesn't matter how much lobbying you do in their view. If you do any, then you should be registered as a lobbyist with the state of Illinois. And the really key test there is when money's changing hands. So when someone is paid to do the work on behalf of an organization or another body or person, so there's compensation for the lobbying activities, that's going to trigger most of these reporting and registration requirements. Next slide, please. However, just like at the federal level, the state does have some codified exceptions that are somewhat favorable to our sector. So for starters, if the only thing you do is submit a witness slip or testify at a hearing, and that's the only type of engagement you have when you're taking a position with legislators on legislation, then you would not need to register if that's all you're doing, because those things are occurring in a public meeting setting, and your position and influence is transparent and part of the public record. So it's the activities that happen outside of those public settings when money's changing hands that the state wants eyes on. The state also does not consider communications related to a state grant or a contract to be lobbying. So if you are working with your grant officer at a state agency about the reporting requirements or the administration of a grant, that wouldn't be considered lobbying. But if you're working with the state agency trying to influence the eligibility for a grant or the amount of money appropriated to a grant, then that would be potentially lobbying. So it's important when managing grants to understand that mysterious line that Norah referenced when things become lobbying and when they're not. And then the state, reporting system for the state is somewhat onerous, where biweekly reports are required. So the report itself is not that difficult, but you do have to have procedures in place to make sure you can meet that biweekly reporting requirement, or else fines apply. And I know folks frequently are fined because it could be hard to back those processes up when someone's on vacation or what have you, or their staff transitions. So it is important, if you decide to register, to make sure you have some policies and procedures in place and redundancies in your administrative work to ensure that you can file those reports on a timely manner, because there's a 5-day grace period before fines kick in. Illinois also has a very expensive fee. Because there's no thresholds for time or expenditures before you have to register, and there's no specific exemptions for nonprofits of any size or type, which most states have. Our fee is essentially the highest in the country. So it's $300 per entity and per lobbyist. So Forefront employs 3 registered lobbyists, so that's a $1,200 a year expense for Forefront, which we can manage because we have unrestricted funds that can cover that, but we understand not every nonprofit, especially smaller nonprofits, have those kind of resources and very grassroots lobbyists. So we understand how that's a huge barrier, and we've been trying to get the fee waived for years. And we're going to continue working on that while taking a different tactic in the spring. So if folks ever have questions about the reporting requirements or the registration process, Forefront's done that repeatedly. We have our heads around it. We'd be happy to walk you through what that looks like if you ever need support with that. Next slide, please. Here's a screenshot of the way the reporting system looks when you log in. So you can see there's different categories where expenses are reportable. The state does not require the compensation of staff to be reported. It only requires the outlays you make for events or meals that you buy for legislators or what have you. So in most cases, nonprofits don't spend a lot of reportable expenditures. And so we're submitting blank reports every 2 weeks, but yet that's still required. Next slide. So I'll move quickly through these next few because I have an eye on time here. But these are just screenshots of what the form looks like if you did have to report expenditures. Next slide. So I don't see questions about the state rules. I'm going to spend a minute on Chicago if we have folks in the room that need that. So a virtual raise of hands if we have folks that lobby the city of Chicago. Does that apply to anyone here today? Okay, we got a few. Okay, thank you. So Chicago also has its own system, which is different than the states and different than the federal governments. So for folks that engage with alderpersons or the mayor, it's important to be aware that Chicago has its own system, and the state, the rules that apply to contacts with local officials at the state level don't apply to Chicago. They apply to every other municipal government in the state, but they carved Chicago out of that rule and allowed Chicago to create its own lobbying registration and reporting system. So that's the only jurisdiction in the state that is not subject to the local lobbying rules that the state levies on every other municipality. So if you lobby the city of Chicago, the Board of Ethics manages their registration and reporting system. And we heavily renegotiated those rules that went into effect about 18 months ago now. And the rules that changed last July are very favorable to our sector. And so we're hoping to kind of replicate those at the state level if we can. Next slide, please. Here's the definition of lobbying and lobbyist at Chicago. It's somewhat similar to the state, but they provide more exceptions and thresholds. So let's move on to the next slide. Like the state, they consider administrative action lobbying, not just ordinances. Next slide, please. Here's the definition of legislative action legislation for your reference later. Next slide, please. The definition of official, which includes city employees. Next slide. So here are the exceptions that I mentioned. So you do not have to register with the city if you spend less than 20 hours on lobbying in a quarter, which is their lobbying period, so every 3 months. Or if you are spending less than $12.50 on compensation. So if the pro rata pay for the time spent on lobbying does not exceed $12.50 in a 3-month period, then if both of those things are true, you don't have to register with the city. So that protects a lot of the smaller nonprofits in the Chicago region. Next slide, please. There's also an exemption for small nonprofits. So if your net assets, which is based on your 990, the net assets line 22 on your 990, if it's less than 5 million, then you would not need to register, even if other things are true. This is an important exception that applies basically at all levels of government that we haven't specifically touched on is the one for volunteers. So that's important for us since many of us have unpaid boards of directors. If you are trying to avoid having to register as a lobbyist with the state or city, and you have lobbying activities conducted entirely by people that are not compensated, then in many cases you would not need to register as a lobbying entity or as a lobbyist. So that's an important thing to note since we often use volunteers. But Norah did touch on some of the rules around volunteers at the federal level. So there's some nuance there. If you have questions, you can always reach out. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of the Chicago reporting rules. We can move along. If you ever have questions, you can let me know. And these are more screenshots of their system, so we can flip through these. The main difference to the state is that at Chicago, you do have to report compensation, and the state does not require you to report compensation. But again, it's pro rata based on the activity just on lobbying, not your entire salary. You can keep going for the sake of time. So here's just a snapshot of the differences between the state and the city. If you ever have questions, again, you can reach out to us and we're happy to chat through. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So this is just a quick, the next few slides are just a quick review of what we've gone over. So if you're trying to decide if you need to register with the state or the city, these slides can help you think through that. And I do think it's good to have a thoughtful conversation about this with your organizations and make sure you're assessing your organizational risk for being out of compliance if you choose not to register. So can you go back to the slide with the questions, please, Lacey? So these are the key questions you need to think about at any level of government. What actions are you engaging in? What activities are you doing? And who's your audience for those activities? Who are you directing messages and recommendations to? And then understanding whether direct lobbying or indirect lobbying or grassroots lobbying would be the characterization for those activities. Are people getting paid or are you using volunteers? Is money changing hands? Are you paying for someone's expenses or time? And then finally, are there exceptions or an exception that may apply to any of that, those prior questions that would then mean you don't need to register? So it's important to have like a thoughtful audit of that and make sure you're making a decision very clear in a clear-eyed way. You can move along. The next few slides are just a summary of these issues. And the main point here is that we just want to encourage folks not to let the rules scare you out of engagement, that once you get your head around the rules, they're manageable, the reporting requirements are manageable, and we can and should engage in the process and use our voices. You can move forward. The thing I'll note here for public charities is that it helps to have, in addition to that conversation around whether or not you should register, to create internal policies and procedures around who's permitted to talk to public officials and under what circumstances, and make sure everybody within your organization understands there's rules that apply here and penalties that apply if you do things incorrectly. And so to help with that, it often helps to consolidate lobbying responsibilities into as few people as possible and make sure everybody within an organization knows who's allowed to talk to elected officials. And if you're in a meeting where there's multiple staff members and one of them is not registered as a lobbyist, that at those meetings you are clear about who says what going into that meeting. And when it's time to do any of the lobbying talk, where you're talking about legislation and taking a position on it and asking a legislator to vote a certain way, that it's real clear that only the registered lobbyist can say those words, and that you make that clear internally and in the meeting itself. So as we wrap up here and talk more about some election year considerations and how to get more involved, I just want to stress that we understand, like a lot of us wear many hats. We are individuals and residents and community members. We're employees of nonprofit organizations, and many of us also serve as volunteers on the boards of other nonprofit organizations. So when you're thinking about your engagements with elected officials who may be covered under these laws, it's important to recognize that different rules apply to each of those different multifaceted parts of our lives, and to be clear about how you're engaging and on whose behalf when you talk to folks. And the work you do as an advocate for yourself and as a community member, as an individual in our society, that's never lobbying. You are allowed, that's part of our democracy, it's free speech. You just have to be clear when you're representing a third party like your employer and when you're speaking as an individual. And that's particularly true in an election season. So we're going to toggle now and talk about that. So here's some key takeaways, and I'm going to, Lacey, you can move forward. I'm going to hand it back to Norah to talk through some specific things that might apply as we enter this next season over the next year leading up to a general election.
Great, thank you. Going back to one of the very first points that we made at the beginning of today's remarks, the bulk of today's focus has been on lobbying and the lobbying rules, but it is very important to always keep in mind that when you are a 501c3 organization, whether you're a private foundation or a public charity, you cannot in any way, shape, or form get involved in a political campaign activity. So no endorsement or opposition directly or indirectly to any candidate for elected public office. That applies, that prohibition applies regardless of the level of government that we're talking about. So obviously the president, our US Congress people, US senators, Cook County board members, City of Chicago mayor, alderpersons, and newer to Chicago, but the elected school board members. Those are elected public positions. And as a 501c3 organization, you are not allowed to get involved in any support of or opposition to any of those candidates. This is a very important rule to keep in mind because even a minor foot fault here can theoretically jeopardize your entire 501c3 status. It is also an area where context really matters. And so you might be, this is another area where you don't want to get too cute with trying to get around the rules. There's some pretty decent roadmaps out there about if you really want to do, candidate panels or candidate questionnaires. There are ways to do it, but you have to be very careful about how you do it. You have to be very careful about how you communicate and reflect candidate answers to questions. You can't, in your reflection of their answers, you can't demonstrate, that you agree with or disagree with one. I am not an example that is not made up. A client a number of years ago shared with us a voter guide that they had prepared. They're a 501c3 organization, and they really had smiley faces by some answers and thumb down by others. That is political campaign intervention. You have to be careful about the way in which you talk about candidates. In other words, when there is a candidate for public office, your radar has to be firing at full steam as you engage with, or if you're going to engage with and work with them. Now, as Holly said, this applies to the organization. It does not apply to the organization's employees. Employees continue, board members, staff members, volunteers continue to have their own personal First Amendment rights to be engaged in the political process in the way that they desire. It is really important that you remind everybody affiliated with your organization that as they do so, they need to be doing so only on personal time, only using personal resources, not using their organizational title or email address or work address, none of that. No photocopying any things in the office. And it is not a bad idea. It's a pretty good idea to regularly remind everybody of these rules, that you want them and encourage them to fully execute and exercise their constitutional rights, but they need to do so in a way that protects the organization. So that, I think, is a good practice to start, if you haven't already, is reminding people of the importance of making sure that any of their political work in particular is very clearly done on personal time and very clearly not associated with your 501c3 organization.
Thanks for that.
Holly,
Yeah, we can
anything to
move
add?
on. Yeah, that was a really helpful summary. And just the thing to underscore here is that this also applies in nonpartisan elections, such as judges. So, and that shows up in our sector sometimes. For example, like child welfare organizations work closely with the court system, and sometimes they might want to give an award to a judge that has been really helpful to their families that they serve. And if that's done right before an election, that judge is is a candidate in, that could have the optics of endorsement. So it's just important to think, as you are in an election season, the same activity might appear to be an endorsement when they're not in an election season, it might be okay. So when you have questions, you can reach out or talk to your own counsel. Next slide, please. There's a couple more examples on this slide of things that are permitted or not permitted. So you can reference this. And one of the things we highlight here is voter engagement, get out the vote efforts that nonprofits can engage in as long as you're mindful of the rules. So I'll put a couple resources for that in chat. And on the next slide, another point around campaign contributions. So a nonprofit organization itself cannot give money to any campaign. Employees can do that from their own personal checking account on their own time, but a nonprofit employer can never reimburse them for that. And it's just a bright line. We cannot support campaigns at all as organizations in the tax exempt sector. Related to voter engagement, we always encourage our sector to consider how they can step into the space. There are rules that apply, but the reason this is really important is because campaigns only talk to prior voters usually, whereas nonprofits are talking to everybody in their community. So nonprofits are uniquely positioned to bring more voters into our democracy. So there's ways to support that as long as you're directing those efforts at potential voters of any party and not only engaging or registering for one party or doing get out the vote efforts for one party. So there's some tools I put in chat that you can look at if you're interested in that space. And recently we got questions about coalition work. So I put this information together, but it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. So I wanted to share also in chat, there's a checklist that the Alliance for Justice has put together for coalition work. And I don't know, Norah, if you want to make any key points on that. If so, I'll pause and let you chime in here or on anything else on voter engagement.
No, I would say for coalitions, collaboratives, affiliations, whatever kind of title you give to it, they can be really obviously impactful, powerful strategies to use that advance the mission. But especially if that coalition is going to be doing anything that touches on lobbying or election related activity, it's really important to spend time up front getting the details right, because otherwise whatever that coalition does is going to likely filter back and kind of infect all the members of the coalition. So if a member of if the coalition or a member of the coalition is doing something that another member of the coalition cannot do, that's trouble for everybody. And so spending the time up front to really get the rules down and try and build in some important safety features is really critical.
Thanks. And I see a chat from Alyssa. Alyssa, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking if you're allowed to contribute to a campaign if your organization or yourself is registered as a lobbyist. Is that
correct? You had little bullet points in the previous slide that said rules may be different in that case.
Let me look back at the slide. Can you go back to the campaign contribution slide, please, Lacey? I'm looking for the comment you saw that may have been the source of your confusion.
Bullet point 2.
Oh, thank you. Good point. That's probably not clear. Okay, so a nonprofit organization can never contribute to a campaign. There's no exceptions for that. If you're a registered entity, you still cannot engage on campaign giving. The second bullet point there references limitations that an individual makes on their own behalf. If you're a registered lobbyist, you may, like for example, the city of Chicago restricts how much money you can give to any particular campaign. So if you're a registered lobbyist, you need to be aware of the limits that apply to you as an individual. So also, if you're a registered lobbyist with the city of Chicago, you have to disclose on your lobbyist reports any campaign contributions you've made to city officials. So it becomes public and it's easily searchable. So they're trying to put sunshine on how lobbyists are influencing candidates by giving. So while you're allowed, you may be registered as a lobbyist on behalf of your own organization, but if you make a personal contribution to a campaign in the city of Chicago, you're going to have to report that to the city if you're a registered lobbyist, even though it's not related to your employer.
That's
Does that make
helpful.
sense?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
not the state, right?
Correct. Yes, the state rules are different.
Thank you.
And this is a confusing area that I'm still learning into. So good questions. So Ricardo asked about how rules apply when calling out a party by name, even if referring to a particular piece of legislation. So that's different. It's an important question. Critiquing the actions of an official in their official capacity as the official and their actions on legislation is different than endorsing them as a candidate. So it's a little bit like nuanced, but you're allowed to critique the actions taken on legislation without that being defined as partisanship. But Laura, do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I agree with I agree with that. And I would just add to it, it's an example of where you have to be really careful and
Yeah.
context matters. As we get closer to elections, statements, like the Republican, the right, MAGA, could very easily be interpreted by the IRS as having a political campaign intent and campaign intervention intent behind them. So you have to be very careful about how messages are crafted, what words you're using, and you have to really think and ask yourself, what are we trying to communicate here by what we're saying? And if what we're trying to communicate is that we got to vote Republicans out of office, then don't make that communication, because that's not something that a 501c3 can do. If instead what you're trying to communicate is recent, actions by Congress have harmed the people that we care about, then that might be a mission or a message that you can communicate in a way that's not political campaign intervention. But timing matters, context matters. And so the closer things get to elections and campaigns, the more challenging it can be to say those types of things.
Yeah, and this was on prior slides, but taking a position on executive orders is not defined as lobbying by the IRS. And that's a important timely factor because a lot of what's happening is folks are critiquing executive orders because of everything happening in this moment. And so it's okay to take a position on an executive order. It doesn't count as lobbying. And you stop short of saying, and therefore you shouldn't, vote for this party or this person in the next election. So focus on the action of the official in their elected capacity versus taking it one step further. We need to move along because of time. So we're going to flip through these ways to get involved and then take any final questions. So it'll help us triage if you put things in chat, but there'll be an opportunity to verbalize questions too shortly. Go ahead, Sebastian.
Thanks, Holly, and I'll be super quick. I had a whole cup of coffee in the past hour, so I'm gonna speed through these. Hi everyone, I'm Sebastian. I just joined Forefront as a policy manager. Prior to this job, I was with the state legislature for 4 years, and I worked for members of Congress here and there as well. So I sort of got to interact with folks from that side of the equation, folks who are visiting state lawmakers in Springfield and their district offices. And so I just want to offer some tips on how to go about engaging with lawmakers. Number one, always recalling and remembering that they work for us, right? Elected officials represent large districts and very diverse constituencies, and they represent the folks in those districts and across the state as well, if they're in a statewide office. I know folks get sometimes a little bit anxious or fearful when they first have to interact with state lawmakers or members of Congress or city council members. And I would just advise not to try and avoid that. So at the end of the day, they should be wanting to hear from their constituents, from stakeholders, and from all of you in the social impact sector. And when you're meeting with lawmakers, it's important to define the problem, right? Like what you're trying to decipher with them and sort of educate them on, but to not only stick to the problem, but also talk about a policy proposal to that problem or a solution that you're trying to present to them as well. So being efficient, concise, and clear is always very important as well. I can tell you from working in the Capitol during the legislative session, especially by May, time there, it's a running joke that the state capitol, I'm assuming the same goes for the US Capitol, it's sort of like being in a casino. Time gets lost in those buildings. And so people are on very tight schedules. Lawmakers are in an abundance of meetings, committee hearings, floor actions that require votes. And so trying to be respectful of that elected officials' time is always very important. And also don't be discouraged about meeting with staff. I can tell you, sometimes when my former bosses weren't around, right, if they were busy doing something else and with the Senate or the House, I would have to speak on behalf as a staffer to various organizations, advocacy groups, nonprofits, lobbyists, and a lot of folks, obviously we're naturally disappointed to not meet the lawmaker directly, but sometimes staffers in the legislature and Congress, even the city councils, they are always absorbing a vast variety of materials and subject matters that are impacting their level of government. And so we're always keeping tabs on what's going on. And that staffer at the end of the day, based on how you approach him, can always share that information with their boss, right? So always try to meet with staff if you can't meet with the elected official themselves. Balancing story with data is also very important. It's definitely important to share stats, reports, data with lawmakers. But if you have a story that's personal to your organization, to somebody that you're representing, that can sometimes drive the point home to a lot of lawmakers on why they should take a substantive stance or vote on a policy issue. And so that never hurts when you're meeting with lawmakers. And same goes, again, with balancing that policy expertise with stakeholders and the needs of folks in that district. And I think that goes into knowing your audience as well, right? Elected officials represent very diverse districts across the state. The demographics, the geography, everything changes depending on who you're speaking to, right? And so keeping into account that having the same scripts for every lawmaker may not be equitable just because their constituencies range so dramatically. And so just keep that into account when you're meeting with these folks, whether it's in Springfield or in Washington, D.C., or in your local city hall, that the areas they represent, the people they represent, the issues that they are prioritizing may vary depending on who you're speaking to. Next slide. And again, just going off of what I just stated, being clear about your ask or recommended solution, time is of the essence. And sometimes, we will be in Springfield, and if we can get a state representative for a minute in the hallways of the Stratton building, we will take that minute, right? So it's important to share, what you're advocating for and what you're trying to present to them in terms of a policy solution and make it clear cut, right? Don't weigh your recommendation down with too much information. It's important to be clear because, again, folks have very limited times in these places. Be patient, give it time. Again, we're in a very busy time period during the legislative session in Springfield, but also in everything going on across the state and across the country. So there's a lot of needs that need to be met. And so just making sure you're being patient and giving these lawmakers and their offices time to respond, to coordinate with your respective organizations. It doesn't hurt to be knowledgeable in the legislative process. I'm trying to skip a few of these right now. Just communicating with the elected official, even if you don't meet with them that day, right? It never hurts to communicate down the road as well, via email, through phone calls, in their district offices, right? That kind of follow-up is very important, and it helps the staffers as well. From my past experience, to remember who you are and who you're representing, right? That constant communication is always very helpful. And so that can be a great asset for all of you as well.
All right, Sebastian, for the sake of time, we're gonna have to move
Sure.
ahead. Appreciate your good advice.
No, you're good.
Lacey, why don't we flip ahead to the poll? There's a QR code. I just want to make sure we flash that up. And then so folks can scan that. Some of you may have already done this because we've been sharing it kind of widely lately. But if you haven't, we'd appreciate that. Our policy committee will be looking at that Friday. And then we can flip ahead to signing up for policy alerts, and Sebastian can take it from there.
Sure. And if there are ever any questions like how to interact with staff, feel free to reach out. But Forefront has an amazing policy action center where you can stay up to speed on what we're advocating for on behalf of the sector when the spring session in Springfield starts, or as Congress takes up new bills, later this year and upcoming in the second half of the 119th Congress. So the link will be dropped in the chat, and we highly encourage folks to sign up for that. Our website also offers an abundance of resources at all three levels of government, right, on what we're prioritizing, primarily at the state and federal level, but sometimes here and there as well locally. We also walk through how to file witness slips if your organizations ever want to take a stance publicly on a bill in the Illinois General Assembly. That's offered through our website as well. And all of the lobbying rules that we went over in today's presentation, I know we've dropped links in the chat the past hour, but all of that's also just right back on our website. So if there are ever any questions on lobbying rules of the state or federal level, that is also on Forefront's website. And if you guys can ever also as well create an account with Congress or with the Illinois General Assembly, there are personal tools on those websites as well to track bills that maybe impact your organization or the populations you serve as well. And those can both be created on those respective websites as well. And additionally, some extra resources for lobbying and advocacy. Earlier, it was mentioned Boulder Advocacy, which is a part of the Alliance for Justice. They have a hotline in regards to lobbying, and as well as an email for any questions you guys have probably on how to go about doing that and following current state law in Illinois. Additionally, the Secretary of State's office for Illinois has an email address that you guys can always as well. If we can't answer your question, the Secretary of State's office has a unit of staff that oversee state law regarding lobbying and ensuring that everyone's following the ethic guidelines that Illinois has in place for registered lobbyists. So that's their email address that goes to their unit. And then we have some resources coming up and events as well. We have a new laws event happening on December 4th with the Illinois Department of Labor on laws that are going to be impacting the sector that currently went into effect or are going to be going into effect January 1st of 2026. We have our legislative kickoff on January 15th of 2026 regarding the policies that Forefront will be advocating for in the new spring session. And then lastly, we have on February 19th an Advocacy 101 training similar to this, but more so geared towards private foundations happening a little bit after the new year as well. And for all events, they are listed on Forefront's website, so feel free to access that as well.
Thanks. We have a couple more slides you'll see when you get the deck, which we will share. We had a question about that. We are going to wrap up. Does anyone in the room have any final questions that we haven't addressed? And we really appreciate folks' time today. Thank you, Norah. We really appreciate you and your expertise. And also to Emily and my team, appreciate you all and your contributions. Emily can turn off the recording and we'll sign off shortly.